Okay, and thank you for the intro, Ian. I'm sharing my screen now. You guys, yeah, there we go. You guys seeing that first slide?
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Take it away.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. This is really fun. So my name's Alex. I'm a PhD student at the University of French Guiana. It's my third year. So given the short duration of PhDs in France, that means I'm already writing up my dissertation. So this has been a great opportunity for me to kind of explore some new ideas, and I really am hoping to kind of, discuss this stuff with you. I hope that you guys are going to be interested and want to share with me and maybe make some comments as well about this presentation. It's very much a work in progress, right? In the long run, maybe I would think about developing this into an article or something. So the guiding question of the presentation for me today is who are the Kws Tshuaj? And I mean, before I go any further, I should say I don't speak Hmong, so I apologize beforehand if I'm mispronouncing terms. If anybody wants to correct me, that's great. But I'm going to use a lot of Hmong terms throughout this presentation. So who are the Kws Tshuaj? Exploring herbs, medicine, spirits, and community health in the Hmong diaspora. So as Ian mentioned, I've been basically working for the last couple of years on a big project studying plant circulation in the Hmong diaspora, which is something that I think we hear a lot about. The movement of plants from Southeast Asia to communities in the diaspora. And then, of course, the constant exchange of plants, through family networks and between friends and neighbors. That's a really widespread phenomena, I think, in all the Hmong communities that I've visited, both in Southeast Asia and in the global diaspora. But, interestingly, despite all the amount of work the research that's been, done in the Hmong studies world, this element of the kind of relationship with plants has not always been really deeply developed. So what we wanted to do with this PhD was focus specifically on this question of, so why do some Hmong people go to great lengths and really expend a lot of effort to move plants from place to place? And so in doing that, of course, I needed to kind of follow the movement of plants from place to place myself in order to understand, what was going on in different places. So starting from French Guiana, where I'm based in Cayenne, I first worked in mainland France. That was fairly easy given the COVID situation. Since it's part of technically the same country, French Guiana is just a French territory, even though it's in South America. And then I later had the opportunity to work in the US, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and eventually went back to, I went to Thailand. Laos was closed at the time, but I went to Thailand and worked in Nan province. So just, on the border with northern Laos there. So I didn't have a chance to visit California. Of course, I regret that a lot. There just wasn't enough time in the short PhD, nor did I visit Australia. And I didn't even put Australia on here in terms of, because none of the data that I collected about the movement of plants was connected to Australia. But essentially, these arrows that you see are indicating the movement of plants from place to place based on data that I collected through this dissertation. So, before going any further, I just want to say very quickly that it's easy to say I did this research, but of course, like any large scale project, this project was actually conducted by maybe 10 to around 15 even researchers with a whole range of different stakes in the project. And it's only because of them that I was able to learn anything at all about this topic. As I mentioned, I don't speak Hmong, so of course that means that when I was trying to learn, especially from elder knowledge holders, I couldn't have those interviews myself. I needed to work either through a translator, or better yet, have a Hmong partner who could kind of go out and pose those questions on behalf of us both, and then bring back some, result of that conversation, and we could discuss that and then deepen and kind of move back and forth. And in that way, using both a kind of insider perspective and an outsider perspective, arrive at something even more deep, I think, than either of us could have done by ourselves. So a huge thank you to all of the partners that I worked with. Like on the upper left, you have a bachelor's student here in French Guiana she partnered with me for her final research project for her bachelor's. So in a way, we had an agreement where the data that we would collect together, I could use for my PhD, and she could also use for her independent research project, that she got her bachelor's degree from. So it was forms of partnership like that I found really rewarding in this project. So, in any case, this woman helped me in the US on the upper right. On the bottom right is another Hmong Studies Consortium member, Jay, who just got his PhD, and this is in Thailand. He was helping me do interviews in Kek Noi. And then on the left is a Thai ethnobotanist. So, to summarize quickly, we conducted interviews in 4 languages, in Hmong, French, English, and Thai. I only speak French and English. So by definition, it was really a group effort. I just want to make that very clear. Okay, so when we started to learn about the plant circulation, of course, one of my first questions was, so how do you use this plant? It's one thing to hear that someone took a plant from Thailand and brought it all the way, through various airports and came to French Guiana and planted that. But why did they do that? What you realize very quickly is that there are only 2 or 3 different main types of plants that have been circulated within the Hmong diaspora. Those concern mostly food plants, especially, like Southeast Asian culinary plants like spices, chilies, cilantro, all kinds of eggplants, and Hmong cucumber, Hmong corn, squashes, bitter squash, ridge gourd, all of the Southeast Asian vegetables, these get transported from Southeast Asia into the diaspora. But there's another set of plants that are even larger and more widespread, which are, of course, the chua plants. So almost all of the plants that get transported, something like 80%, are actually medicine plants. This is the greatest diversity and the greatest abundance. So what is chua Hmong? What is this idea of Hmong medicine? Essentially, the use of chua is really like a very integral element, I would say, of Hmong traditional healing practices, and traditionally it played a role alongside shamanism and with many other modalities, including massage and, a huge range of different practices that kind of work together in a patchwork form to contribute to community health. The role of chua, however, is probably even more central than a lot of these other modalities, because in villages in Laos and Thailand, every single home keeps chua, keeps medicine plants. These small medicine gardens are kind of considered like a sort of medicine cabinet, kind of pharmacopoeia that people can use to heal themselves, their children, their family members, that are located usually just right outside the house. Of course, there's a whole nother category of plants that are in the forests that are not grown. And, those are often more valuable, sometimes considered more potent medicines. And it's really those 2 different forms of medicine, home garden medicines and forest medicines that kind of comprise together the category, you know, Chua Hmong, or which of course goes beyond that, because a lot of chua is also used in a dried form. A lot of these medicine plants are cut in pieces, powdered even, you know, and in that form, they can last a very long time. They can also be traded and sent very far distances. To be very clear, what I'm talking about when I speak about plant circulation is the movement of living plants from one place to another. And so this does not really concern dried chua, but it really connects more with the tradition of chuanjua, the green, the fresh herbs, the fresh medicinal herbs, which are probably the most important element of the kind of Hmong pharmacopoeia, are these plants that are used very fresh, you know. And of course, like one of the most widespread ways of using these plants, or one of the applications of chua that's most familiar, I would say, is probably chochakai. I mean, I'm not even sure how to spell it. I apologize if I misspelled it. I've seen it spelled 3 different ways, and I'm not sure which one is objectively correct. But you know, we're all familiar with the idea. You boil a chicken with a bunch of chochakai herbs. Like these herbs on the right are all had just been harvested to prepare chochakai, of course. And this is an extremely important tonic food, which is also critical for the postpartum period, and is also really important for treating certain severe illnesses. So chochakai is really interesting because it can be eaten just to enjoy as a kind of medicinal food. It can be eaten as part of a very important and somewhat strict medicinal diet, like in the postpartum usage after birth. And it can also be used as a kind of focused medicinal treatment for someone who really has a serious malady, you know, a serious illness of some kind. So chochakai is probably the most familiar and widespread form of chua, or chuanjua, but there are basically hundreds of species of these plants. So in all of the communities where I worked, my doing surveys in farms and gardens revealed somewhere between 200 and 500 species of Chua Hmong plants that were growing, you know, in people's gardens and yards and farms and greenhouses. It's a huge diversity. So a lot of times the use of chua was something that fell more often within the domain of female knowledge. That's obviously not true across the board, and it seems sometimes to be even an unsafe expectation to make. But at the same time, I think we can agree that there's a kind of common sense relationship that the experts on herbal medicine and those who tend to know the most tend to be older women in the Hmong community. And those women would tend to transmit their knowledge down to younger family members. And through those lines of transmission, often gendered, but not always, these traditions of using Chua Hmong have been passed on for a very long time. A lot of these plants do originate in China, actually. And as I kind of quickly mentioned, you know, today, Chua actually creates a kind of important circulation and even a kind of informal market. You know, I've seen dried medicine plants from Laos being sold in, well, every Hmong market that I've almost ever been to. So there's a huge amount of circulation of both the dried and the living plants. And so this was really like at the heart of our study. We didn't know this going into it, that most of the circulated plants would be chua. But very quickly we realized that chua was the most important category of plants being circulated, which, you know, naturally leads us to the question that I began to ask in the early days of fieldwork. I started to ask, so who knows the most about Chua Hmong, you know? And this is where I first encountered the term Kuchua. And people would say, well, there are some very wise older people, they can be men or women, who are considered experts in herbal medicine. We could call them a Hmong pharmacist, a Hmong doctor, a Hmong herbalist. I've heard a lot of different translations of this term. And so this was the basic response that I received many times to this question. And then, of course, I would ask, so are there any Kuchua around here I can talk to? And of course, this is very, interesting, because most of the time people say, oh, they've passed away, and so this, and yet I would also meet people, many people who had, 150 species of medicine plants growing in their yard and knew how to use all of them. And I would say, so are you Kuchua? And they would say, oh no, I'm not a Kuchua, but my grandmother was. So of course, this kind of piqued my interest. And it was these early experiences that kind of pushed me to start asking more questions and trying to understand, what really is this term? What does this term mean within the Hmong community? What is the significance of this term? And is it changing? And why is it that it's so hard to meet people like this, even though everyone tells me about people like this? So I think that kind of sets up the research question for me, really. So to look at the term for a moment, Kws, again, I don't speak Hmong, so it's kind of silly for me to say. Please correct me if this is incorrect, but people have told me that it means something like teacher or master or expert, and then it comes directly from Lao and Thai, the word ku meaning teacher, and it's obviously used in other livelihoods in the Hmong language, like forager and so on. And Chua, this is quite interesting. It was, I had a meeting with Jack Lewan in Bangkok, and he was the first one who made me recognize that Chua is actually coming from the Chinese word cha, from tea, and of course, most of the Southeast Asian languages have a word for tea that's, basically the same as cha. And so cha and chua, you see the continuity there. So in the same way that in English, tea can refer to one plant, or it can refer to a preparation for any number of plants, chua kind of takes on that universal sense of being any medicine plant that might be used in tea or in other forms, right? So in the literature, when I started to search, this term Kuchua, I found most people translating it directly as herbalist. I even found articles, for instance, where they'll have a Hmong language extract, and they'll have Kuchua, the term in the Hmong language extract. But in the English translation of the abstract, it'll say herbalist, And I found it very interesting, this kind of one-to-one translation, because of course it's fairly correct. An herbalist is an expert in administering herbal medicine. The problem really is that an herbalist is also, at least the way that it's usually understood, an herbalist is not a spiritual practitioner. It's a different kind of doctor, And so as I got deeper into the Kuchua tradition, I started to question, I wonder how accurate that is, In the literature, again, almost every source says that the Kuchua tradition is associated with women, primarily older women. So throughout my crazy journeys, across the Hmong diaspora and then back to Thailand, I basically started to track down people who could potentially be considered experts in herbal medicine, and interview them. And I would interview them not just about the plants that they grow and the way that they circulate those plants, but also about their practices in relation to plants, their beliefs, the transmission of knowledge, all of these more anthropological questions that are essential actually to understanding what's going on here with this deep relationship between Hmong communities and Chua. So I was really lucky to interview almost 20 folks that I, have considered to be Kuchua. We'll come back to this later. And they were pretty well mixed, right? So a handful in Thailand, a handful in France, and also in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and in French Guiana. So the rest of the talk, from now on is basically based on the data gleaned from those 18 interviews. It's a very small sample size, but I think you guys will agree that these days, people who could be considered Kuchua are becoming a little bit rare. And so if there were 60, I would have interviewed 60. Let's say that these were all the folks I could find after almost 2 years of work on this subject. And to be clear, I've interviewed hundreds of people, and everyone knows a little bit of medicine. But these 18 people are at a completely different level of knowledge, really an extraordinary depth and breadth of knowledge that allows me to think of them as a kind of expert. So based on these interviews, I mean, what is a Kuchua? Who is a Kuchua? What characteristics do they have? Well, at least in my own sample, the question of the gendered nature of this knowledge was very clear. 16 out of 18 of these folks were women, and so that seems very clear that yes, in some ways this is a strongly gendered tradition. It's maybe a bit dangerous to speak of it as women's knowledge, or because obviously there are men involved as well. But overall, from my own experience, it seems to be mostly a female tradition. A Kuchua was considered to be someone with substantial, is not even the right word, really a level of expertise. Something a lot of people compared Kuchua to pharmacists and doctors, because they spoke about a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of illness and healing. A lot of people mentioned the idea that a Kuchua, a true Kuchua, would share plants and remedies outside the family, outside the lineage, outside any connection of clan or even village. Someone could come from very far away and consult a Kuchua, and they would give them the same level of treatment as they might give to their neighbor. This was the way people describe Kuchua. And they pointed out that a lot of times the knowledge of medicinal plants is passed down through families and can be exclusive. That's not something you would necessarily share widely outside of your own family networks. And a Kuchua is someone who would share that knowledge. So that was one characteristic that was mentioned often. Obviously, a Kuchua has to be someone who engages with medicine plants, which really means that they either grow them themselves or they gather them from the forest. Some people do both. Most people nowadays, especially in the diaspora, are growing their medicine plants, and very few are gathering. In Thailand, some of them tended to be folks that would go to the forest and gather wild chua, but other folks were really mostly concerned with cultivating and collecting a chua garden, a vat chua. In addition, Kuchuas are usually said to be people who accept monetary offerings for their knowledge and their services. We'll come back to that. And as I kind of mentioned a little bit already, a Kuchua, even though they may share plants with patients and people who come from afar, they also can very jealously guard their knowledge, to the extent that even like if they decided that there was no one in their own family who was capable of learning their expertise, they might decide not to pass on their knowledge. So there's a sense that Kuchuas are always practicing with the herbs, always diffusing healing, but at least in past times, there seems to be a sense in the literature and in the interviews that I did that Kuchuas could often be very protective of their specific knowledge traditions. Partly maybe because of what I just mentioned, the idea of monetary offerings. There's an economic side to all of this that I'll come back to. And this is where it gets, of course, interesting as well. There's the question of working with medicine spirits. And some of these Kuchua do spiritual practices where they basically enter into kind of spiritual relations with these, what we could call medicine spirits. Whereas others work strictly with the physical plants, and they really could be considered something like a European herbalist today. So what does it look like to work with these medicine plants? First of all, the problems treated are extremely widespread. Definitely feminine health and fertility come up a lot. This seems to be one of the most important categories. Medicines to treat infertility, medicines to treat all kinds of problems with menstrual cycles, really any number of women's health issues that you can imagine that we found remedies for. In addition, respiratory problems, digestive problems, a lot of problems with different organs, kidney issues, liver problems, skin issues, eye, communicable diseases. In fact, almost anything could be treated with Chua, but not everything, right? Not everything. Some problems that were considered to be wholly spiritual in nature are usually referred to a shaman rather than a Kuchua. So there is a limitation to the extent of this Chua tradition to deal with problems. Some people would report going to a Kuchua at the beginning, and then if that wasn't successful, then going to seek out a shaman's help later on. So I started to already early on see some of the interactions between the Chua, the Chua tradition and Waneng, right? Like this like almost like two forms of very complementary medicine. And I found that there were a lot of quite strict rules. Rules is not really the right word, but consider it more means of maintaining respect for the plants. A lot of these folks, for instance, when they're on their period, they will not go when these women are on their period. If they're young enough to still be, menstruating, they won't touch their plants at that time. There's also kind of some guidance or some rules about how to harvest the plants, how to grow the plants. For instance, some people told me that they only harvest the medicine plants in the early morning or late in the evening when the vital forces of those plants are the strongest. They never harvest them in the middle of the day. There's a lot of very special ways that you should relate to your plant. Many people spoke about always picking an odd number of leaves instead of an even number, right? There are so many beliefs associated with this that it's difficult to even kind of dig into it. I think I just want to mention that for Kuchua, growing plants is not a thoughtless act. It's something that requires continual intentionality to maintain a good, respectful relationship with those Chua plants. Some people told me that the Chua are like people; they're like humans, and if we respect them, then they'll help us. If we don't respect them, then they won't. So after diagnosing a problem and then choosing a medicine plant, the medicine would be administered, via any number of different treatment modalities. It's kind of worth noting that teas, so infusions and decoctions, are pretty widespread. Chochokai, or like cooking with chicken, like stuffing a chicken, boiling a chicken with herbs, steaming a chicken with herbs, any number of ways to combine chicken and herbs is really widespread, and that's especially prescribed for situations where there's any kind of physical weakness, where there's a need to, there's this restorative quality to the lean meat of the chicken and the chicken broth that's considered to kind of work really well with the medicinal effects of the herbs. And then probably one of the most unique modalities of using these plants is cutting up the fresh herbs, mixing them in an egg, and then steaming the egg and then eating it. That's very unique. I mean, I've been studying ethnobotany from different groups in Southeast and South Asia for quite some time, and I had never come across that way of using medicine plants. And of course, that's one of the most common ways that Chua are prescribed. So how is the knowledge of these plants passed on? As I kind of mentioned earlier, basically everyone in this study said that they learned from their mother and their mother's mother, sometimes their mother-in-law or their sisters-in-law, there was their aunts, great aunts. There was usually always a gendered transmission of knowledge within the family structure. And the same was true for men. The few men that I interviewed, they also said, oh, I learned from my father and my father's father and my father's brothers. And so again, this idea of the transmission of the plants themselves and the accompanying knowledge and the kind of medicinal power of those plants and those knowledge, that transmission of that is something that remains within family lines, family lineages. Yeah, so I mentioned this already, that actually there were experts in the past who either their own children were not interested, or they deemed their own children for some reason not able to learn, and they would decide not to teach anyone. I met a few people who had learned not from their parents but from their grandparents, and they claimed in that case that the position of kind of relationality with the Chua had skipped a generation. And today, of course, the question of jealously guarding knowledge, things are changing, right? Like there were sometimes, older women that I met in my study, and I explained what I was doing, and they very clearly didn't want to talk to me, Well, of course, that's fine. We left them alone, But most people were extremely open to talk about these things. And I found that a bit surprising when I started to read more about the traditions and understand that this knowledge in the past was very carefully guarded. But a lot of people who I spoke to, especially women in like the 50s and 60s, sometimes in the 1.5 generation of folks, that might have been born outside of the diaspora, but kind of grew up in the diaspora. A lot of those folks were very conscious that the knowledge of Chua is quickly disappearing, and today they feel that there's a different need, that rather than carefully guarding that knowledge and kind of maintaining that knowledge for the family, a lot of people are really happy to teach anyone at all, even someone who's not from their culture, but just kind of comes with curiosity. So I thought a lot about that throughout this project of how can this knowledge be gathered together in such a way that would be useful for helping it transmit into the future. There was a real need expressed by many people to safeguard this critical knowledge, which is so quickly disappearing. So, these are just beautiful pictures of this kind of transmission that I'm talking about. This is, in France, some in France. And so both of the women on the the women on the left in both photos are both older women. They don't speak French. They're first generation refugees. Both of them work with the medicine spirits and the physical plants. They both brought a lot of plants from Asia. And here they are, both giving plants away to younger women that are maybe 20 or 30 years younger than them. And those women who are on the right-hand side of both photos, both, are bilingual, and kind of they're the bridges, like a lot of 1.5 generation folks, between the kind of older way of life and the kind of way of life in diasporic countries. And so I love, for instance, the woman on the left is taking a video of the plants, as this older woman explains to her. They're going to take these plants home and plant them and then use them in the future. So let's come back to this idea of the medicine spirits, because this was one of the most interesting things that I, learned during all of this, is that at a certain point, very often later in life, sometimes after, some people told me it has to happen after you've grown up. Some people told me you have to have had children, and the children have to have grown up. Some people said that your parents have to have passed away before this happens. So it could be quite old. Some people, this doesn't happen until the 60s or the 70s even. And at that point, like 5 people out of the 18 that I worked with reported a kind of, I used the kind of like a sort of term from Eliade, this idea of an initiatory sickness, that's basically very comparable to the sickness that can be indicative of shamanism, of having kind of a link with the Neng. And so this sickness can take a lot of different forms. It most commonly takes the form of pain in the hands and feet. Some people specifically told me that pain in the hands and feet is the indication that you have a relationship with the medicine spirits. But of course, it could be pain in other body parts, any kind of vague, undefined illness, often lasting a long time and difficult to identify the cause. Finally, at the end of this whole process of a kind of undergoing what I'm calling an initiatory sickness, there's a moment when people seek the help of a shaman or some other family member that has some spiritual gifts, and they are diagnosed to have a link with the Chua or the medicine spirits. So the term that I came across most commonly for the medicine spirits was Chua. I question, to what extent that is the right term. Obviously, Da by its own, on its own is has a very different meaning, can be more spirit in a bad sense, even something a bit demonic. But Da Chua, the way that it was explained to me, is that medicine spirits, these are very good spirits that help people, and like household spirits or shaman spirits or many other things. So I think this question remains open. Chua is definitely the most widespread term that I found in my interviews and in the literature. However, some people also mention Chua, so like soul, right? Like the soul of the medicine, I guess. Again, please, feel free to jump in and correct me or with pronunciations or anything. And Tatsuchua, so like the owner of the medicine, the idea of like an owner spirit, similar to the owner spirits that would inhabit the landscape. And then the last term that we stumbled upon sometimes was Yuva. And Yuva is very interesting because this also derives directly from Chinese. It comes from what the Chinese call the god of medicine, Yao Wang. And the Chinese god of medicine is a figure, that is a, he's a real king, he kind of has a royal bearing. There's some illustrations, and he's a kind of doctor medicine spirit. And so in the Chinese tradition, this is, refers to a very specific character. But in the way that the term is used in the Hmong context, a lot of people told me that Chua, Yuva, it's, they're the same thing, just different words for the same thing. We heard them used interchangeably sometimes in prayer. So half of, I guess I should have said this first, but of the 18 people that I interviewed, half of them maintain an altar to the medicine spirits, Chua. So that's actually a huge number, 50%, and this is this is maybe the element of the tradition that's the least explained in the literature, is the fact that the work of the Chua, or whatever we want to call it, working with Chua, is not simply a physical exercise, but for a lot of people, in my experience, at least half, still today, and maybe a lot more in the past, there's a really critical spiritual aspect to this work with medicine plants. For those who basically, of all of those 9 people who maintain spirit altars, say that the Dat Chua were inherited from their own family members. So I would learn about someone maintaining one of these altars, and of course I would ask them, did anyone else in your family have such an altar? And all 9 of them, and even one other person who no longer who doesn't maintain an altar, but they told me that their mother and their mother's mother and mother's mother's mother kept a medicine altar, a medicine spirit altar. So this idea of the transmission, not just of the knowledge and of the plants, but actually of the spiritual relationship down through the family, this was very, very widespread. People really spoke about the Dat Chua as if they were beings that formed alliances with certain family lineages, and then would be passed down to those who were capable of receiving them. So, if it's not obvious, all of the altars on the right here are Dat Chua altars. These altars are just for the Dat Chua. They can take myriad forms, they're always arranged along with the other altars, in that part of the house. So here's a woman actually making, an offering of incense at her altar. In this case, it was to ask permission to tell us about her medicine plants. So whenever possible, we ask people to, do whichever rituals or make whatever offerings would be necessary in order to make sure that no spiritual harm came to them by working with us, So the common offerings at the Dat Chua altar are obviously prayer. People, pray directly to the medicine spirits. They always burn incense, and they always burn spirit money, and usually their offerings of real money as well. The altar, like any other, traditional Hmong altar, would be renewed at New Year's, with chicken sacrifice to kind of renew its energy, and feed the Dat Chua. And this is very important, like I mentioned. So the initiatory sickness is considered like that's something that is caused by the Dat Chua, that it's a way of kind of getting the attention of the person. A lot of folks say that they got sick because they weren't fulfilling their duties to the Dat Chua. For instance, people will say, oh, I was giving away a lot of plants for free, and when people tried to give me money, I would refuse the money, and then I got sick. And so people would often link the idea that they were not working with the medicine plants in a way that was appropriate with the fact that they became sick. In other words, the Dat Chua can make you sick in order to force you to come into a more respectful relationship with the Chua plants. So the same thing goes not just with the initiatory sickness, but also later on. People say that, even after you learn that you have a link with Dat Chua, you construct an altar, you make offerings, but if at any point you do something disrespectful, like not accepting monetary offerings, or for instance, to take money and then not place it on the altar, but just put it right in your pocket, to give away a lot of plants, to maltreat your plants. I heard a lot of different versions of this, but there was a basic belief that if that happens, the Dat Chua can make the person themselves sick. So this was something that we were constantly careful of and aware of when we were in the field to make sure that everything that we did never had a potential to kind of rebound in a negative way on the people that we were working with. These stories are taken very, very seriously, you know. So how do people communicate anyway with these medicine spirits? By the way, on the right, you have a picture here of Yuva, you know, it's called the king of medicine, you know, and this is a picture from Motin's famous book about shamanism. So people are communicating with the ntsuab through, you know, different methods. Remember, there was only 9 that have an altar. So even more, 12 out of 18 mentioned that they pray to the plants. You know, they pray and they ask the plants to heal someone. You know, they ask the plants for help, for guidance. You know, a surprising number of people also have dreams and visions with the plants themselves. The plant spirits, I should say. Anyway. One person uses the ox horn divinatory device, and she mentioned tossing the kua in order to communicate with the Dachua and kind of posing a series of questions to become, you know, in the same way that they'd be normally used in order to understand more and more about the illness and what type of plants could be needed. So it was a kind of a given exchange questioning process. A lot of people kind of anecdotally mentioned just having intuitions, having certain feelings about plants and about which plant they should give to someone. You know, a lot of folks say when someone comes to me, you know, it's not that I always, you know, get a dream later that night and then I wake up and I know what plant. It's often just a very subtle feeling, a very subtle sense of, I think, I have a feeling that that might be the plant for you. And people who work with these medicine plants, you know, they might have 6 different things that can work on a respiratory infection. So how is it that you select, you know, which of those plants you're going to give? A lot of people rely a lot on developing this kind of deep intuition, you know, which of course, when you're working with medicine spirits, there's a spiritual element to this kind of listening to your intuition. So to go into further depth about this kind of question of dreams and visions, the dreams can take many forms. One form is that there are literally spirits that come to the person and present them with plants in the dream, usually teach them about how to use those plants. Another example would be people who have dreams that predict when someone will come to them, like when you know, they'll have a dream and then 3 days later that same person that they dreamt of will come and consult them. In that way, they're kind of forewarned, you know. They consider those dreams to be sent by the Dachua to warn them, you know, oh, I should maybe harvest some of this plant, or, you know, maybe should prepare myself, make sure I'm here on Wednesday morning, you know. There was this sense of kind of that exchange of knowing sometimes about what would happen. For instance, I mean, you know, this happened to me, you know, I sometimes went to visit people and they said, I dreamed that you would come, you know, and that's quite a feeling, you know. Some people had already decided how much they would or would not tell me about this tradition based on the dreams of guidance that they received, you know. Other people who gather chua from the forests, they sometimes get dreams telling them where the plants are located. So someone might come to see them and then tell them the problem, and then they would the kuchua would go to sleep that night and have a dream, and in the dream they would see in the forest exactly where the medicine plant is located that they need to heal that person. Wake up the next morning, go and get the plant, and then present it to the person. A couple different people mentioned this idea as well. Just gonna check the time. Okay, so we should keep moving. So how does one initiate this relationship with the Dachua to begin with, I did not find anyone who mentioned, even people who maintain a Dachua altar today, no one mentioned having actually done this ritual or this practice. But Tapp has a 1989 article on Hmong religion where he devotes one paragraph to describing the Fei Dachua, the ritual of dividing the Dachua. This is basically a kind of ritual to transmit the Dachua from one person who already has a relationship with those Dachua to an apprentice, to a younger woman or a younger man who's learning about the medicine plants. So like I said, very few people mentioned this. I learned about this really toward the end of my field work, and only when I was in Thailand. So, again, a sign that this practice appears to be decreasing. No one that I met had done this or had seen it. So in Tapp's description from 1989, he mentions, basically he says that the Kuchua would gather, she would go to the forest, go to the garden, she would gather all the medicine plants she knows, bring them back to her home, a huge bundle, and then have the younger woman who wants to leave, and both of them would pray to the Dachua altar together and ask the Dachua to go from the Kuchua into the apprentice. And then she would physically, the Kuchua would separate the bundles of medicine plants into two, and then physically give the medicine plants to the apprentice, along with the blessings to go and create her own altar. So it was a kind of both a physical and a spiritual transmission at the same time. The idea was to divide the relationship or the power or the wisdom and knowledge of these plants into two equal parts, and then to disperse it in that way. The only person I met who could give me a description of the ritual was a very old woman in her 80s in Keknoi, who told me that her grandmother used to do this ritual, but her grandmother did a simple form that involved just taking the water from the altar and dividing it into 2 cups, and then giving that water to the young woman to drink, so that she was also taking some of that blessed offering from the Dachua altar and drink it. And this woman said that after the young woman had drank that water, she would remember very, very well all of the medicine plants that she had learned. So to kind of move beyond that spiritual element, as I mentioned earlier, this is a lot of work. First of all, this is a huge amount of work. Maybe not quite on the scale of shamanism, but there's still a huge amount of effort and time going into this kind of role of being basically a public health practitioner. So there's naturally some recompense for that. Kuchua basically, they universally receive monetary offerings for their advice and their treatments and the plants that they give. The question is when. Some of them will accept a little bit of money at the beginning. When someone comes to seek help, they'll offer often some incense, some spirit money, and some physical money, and they'll put that straight on the altar and leave it there, usually for at least 3 days, so that it can be offered first to the spirits, and then later they'll probably take it for themselves. But everyone mentioned that if you give someone medicine plants and they're healed, then they come back and they should offer you money at the end. Of course, in actual reality, all of these practices are changing a lot, but in theory, this is how it used to work. Furthermore, I think we've all heard about this. Some of these medicine plants, especially very powerful ones, whose knowledge was not widespread, were considered very, very valuable. And some of these Kuchua would sell the knowledge of how to use these plants to specific individuals. And it could be for a lot of money, right? I mean, there's a picture of a silver coin here, that I found somebody keeping in Javaway, but in reality, I mean, this is the kind of thing you might really pay silver for. These medicine plants were extremely sought after. In fact, some people tap, for instance, no, and in fact, Lemoine also mentions the idea that the entire status of Kuchua could be sold. I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but maybe what he means is that if you had the money, you could buy the knowledge of plant after plant from many different people and eventually kind of, basically teach yourself to become a Kuchua by paying for it rather than by, inheriting the medicine spirits. So obviously this points to the two very different kind of forms that Kuchua practice can take. And just to point out that, of course, today, of all the people I interviewed, not that many of them sell plants. I mean, sell like commercially, but 4 of them, do sell commercially on the international or national level. So, the question of the economic element of working with Chua is still very interesting. Right. So this is also very interesting, this question of how what Chua and Oanang, how do they kind of interact, right? So of the 9 people that I mentioned who had a Dachua altar, 6 of them, so 2/3, are also shamans. The women's, for instance, the altar on the right that you see here, this is a shamanic altar, but she explained to me that one of the lower level niches there is devoted to the Dachua. So for her, she actually received the Dachua before she received the Neng into her life. So she had at first a very small and modest Dachua altar, and later when she, obviously got more experience with shamanism and her altar became more and more complex, the Dachua altar became integrated into the shamanic altar. And I think that kind of symbolizes the way in which these traditions can be really intermingled. As I mentioned, some people, they become shamans first, so someone gets sick, they have that initiatory sickness, that illness period. They go to a shaman, and a shaman might tell them, oh, you have Dachua, you need to make a Ta Dachua. Or they might say, you have Neng, you need to, find a teacher and, begin working with the Neng and learn how to shake and so on. And so it could really be one or the other, one of the men, for instance, was a shaman, and he didn't feel called by the Dachua, but he set up a Dachua altar out of respect, because he said, once I became a shaman, I realized I can't play around with this anymore. I've been using and selling medicine plants for many years. And now that I have this kind of spiritual element of my life, I know that I have to respect the Dachua as well. So, there can be so many different motivations and ways that these kind of practices can arrive for different people. One person, this was very interesting, said, well, if you have Neng, you have Dachua. Dachua are kind of, they didn't go as far as saying that Dachua were a type of Neng, but they said they were a spirit that was totally comparable to the shamanic spirits. And so this person was basically claiming all shamans have Dachua, And of course, if we look into the story, Shi Yi and there's associations between shamanism and medicine plants that go very deep, in kind of Hmong consciousness. So what about non-traditional religions? What about the many folks that are turning to Christianity today? So how does that look like? So, from what I found anyway, Christianity generally prohibits the worship of any kind of spirits. This picture is not, these are not Hmong people, obviously. In fact, I took this picture here, but for me, it's illustrative of the point, because this is this was on a public signboard at a Catholic holy site in the forest nearby here. And what this red arrow is saying is that we do not want any local women to do spiritual plant baths with magical charms here at our Catholic site. This happens all the time, right? So the point here is the antagonism and the conflict, between access to spiritual worlds, between organized religion groups, in this case, mostly church groups, and the kind of folk traditions, traditional spiritual traditions of all forms, So this actually gets quite serious. I mean, I had 2 of the 18 people mentioned having quite serious conflicts, within their own family, with their own children sometimes, and others who had become Christian. And that was the reason that these 2 old women didn't maintain an altar. Both of these women said that they wanted to maintain an altar, but they couldn't because their Christian family. Well, in fact, this gets even deeper. So actually, one of these women was in Keknoi, and she got her initiatory sickness. She was diagnosed as a Kuchua. She set up her altar. She practiced for many years. And then she got sick, and when she got sick, her children, who had at that time become Christian, kind of came to her and said, "Mom, you're sick because you're worshiping demons, and you have to stop this stuff." And of course, she didn't want to give up her altar. Eventually, her children actually got the preacher of the local church to come to her home, and the preacher himself, with the support and aid of her family, burned her altar. I mean, they took the altar out of her home and burned it, and they put up a picture of Jesus in the place of her Dachua altar. So I was quite shocked by the fact that these kind of events still occur, but of course they do. So all of this is to say that there's a great deal of tension between Christianity and the worship of the medicine spirit. That doesn't mean that there's any problem between Christianity and the use of chua. I would say that there are just as many, maybe not just as many, but there are plenty of experts of herbal medicine in the Christian Hmong communities. It's just that spiritual element of it has been removed, right? So that's one reason, for instance, that some of the people I interviewed don't have medicine altars. It might have been that their parents, their grandparents did, but now that they're Christian, they are kind of continuing the same tradition of using these medicine plants, but they're not engaging with the spiritual side of that practice, right? So these practices are evolving, in relation to all of the different things that are happening in the community. So all of this, I mean, I hope I've given you guys kind of a big picture, of my journey of learning about this tradition. So let's come back to the original question. So who is a Kuchua anyway? So to be very clear, 0 people that I interviewed said, "I am a Kuchua." All of them refused to be labeled this way. Every single one of them knew the term, and all of them said, yeah, we used to have people like that when I was young, but they've all died long ago. People said that everywhere I went, from Thailand to Wisconsin, This is quite interesting. So Kws did an article in 1994 where she worked with 4 different women who called themselves Kuchua in Kansas. So obviously this was in the early days of the diaspora, but clearly at that point in time, there were women, and even a lot of them, she found 4 in Kansas, it wasn't California, she found 4 different women there that were all self-professed Kuchua. So apparently in the early days of the diaspora, there still were a lot of people around who were happy to answer to that name. Furthermore, and perhaps of more interest, Dubost, just a couple of years ago, as part of his PhD work in Laos, he did interviews with 8 different women in Shenkong who claimed to be Kuchua. And this is particularly interesting because the other 6 herbal experts that he interviewed that were not women, that were men, they didn't say that they were Kuchua. So actually, he interviewed a group of 14 herbal experts. The women said, "We're Kuchua," and the men said, no, we're not that. So very interesting, and perhaps instructive, but again, I don't know how much of a conclusion we can draw from all of this, except to say that in the past, there were a lot more Kuchua. Today, the tradition's, diminishing, but maybe it's still stronger in Laos than it is in Thailand or anywhere else. Ian, are we running out of time? I just have a couple more.
Yeah, a couple more, but just it'll limit the amount of questions you get.
Okay, I think there's only like 2 more slides. So can we define Kws Tshuaj to rush to the end here? It's mostly a female tradition. At least outside of Laos, today, I would argue that it's more of a concept or an ideal than a true identity or a title that people carry. To summarize everything I've said today, it basically, the term seems to refer to a broad spectrum of health practitioners, ranging between people who are talented herbalists with lots of knowledge, but don't do any spiritual practice. And also some people who work with medicine spirits, but know very little about plants. I interviewed at least one woman who said, well, I have datua. She had this sickness and everything. She'd set up the altar, but she said, I don't know anything about medicine plants. So when people come to ask me for help, I pray to the datua, ask the datua to help the person. They give an offering. And then I tell the person, okay, go home and use whatever medicine plant you were already going to use, but now it'll work better, So, fascinating to see to what extent, people kind of fall within this range. So in conclusion, Ocho and Oaneng are linked forms of Hmong healing. They're complementary, they're linked. I would argue that the bias toward male traditions, which is widespread everywhere in anthropology, is probably part of the reason that we know so little about the Kws Tshuaj tradition, especially compared to shamanism. We know so much about Hmong shamanism. So much remains to be learned, including the historical role of Kws Tshuaj, how the tradition is changing, and specifically the plants and the treatments. What is the future of Kws Tshuaj? The tradition is continuing. Less and less people are calling themselves Kws Tshuaj. Today, the use of Hmong is, part of a medical pluralism perspective where people use biomedicine, Hmong traditional medicine, and many other techniques mixed together. And perhaps most interestingly, the knowledge tradition today is no longer relegated to the lines of family. It's more and more often happening online, especially on Facebook groups and YouTube videos, and also through books. So if any of this piques your interest and you want to learn more, here are 4 fantastic books about Hmong in English, French, and Hmong, And so voila, that's all. There's my email if anybody wants to email me. And otherwise, I think I'll go back to this slide because it's,
Actually, what I'd like you to do is unshare so we can all see each other.
Yes.
Okay.
No. Okay, there we go.
There you go. Okay, great. Thank you. That was a fascinating presentation and a great job, Alex. So we have a limited amount of time left here, but we do have some time. So if you have any questions, I would like you to, keep your questions rather short so we can get through as many as possible if we have some. So does okay, Zua, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for that really interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could speak to your definition of Itu Kws Tshuaj and why it is that you kind of very narrowly defined it as kind of the way that you did, and you speak to this a little bit towards the end where you say, there's a spectrum of people who, on the one hand, may be more herbalist and decoupled from the spirituality or the natural piece of it. And the folks that you spoke to were more of the traditional form. And so I was curious, why you chose that spectrum as opposed to kind of also comparing with those who are practicing or herbalists but are decoupled, because I would imagine that if you did both, the numbers of people who are practitioners of Hmong herbalists would be significantly larger. For instance, my mother is one, and she's a Christian, and I myself am one and practitioner. But and so I think in other words, how much selection bias comes into play because of your definition, the way that you're choosing your population.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so to be clear, I'm trying to kind of like, what I've been trying to do is explore this term that was mentioned to me, right? So at the root, I think the conclusion that I can make is that it's fuzzy. As I mentioned, I didn't meet a single person who defined themselves as a Kws Tshuaj. These 18 people that I've selected are, simply put, the people who have a level of expertise way, way, way above the kind of normal level of knowledge, which is quite significant. I interviewed, a couple hundred people all across the Hmong world, and I didn't find any of them that don't know herbal medicine, right? So of course, it's very difficult to kind of draw the line, like you're saying, between who knows some things and who knows a lot of things. In fact, there's no way that we can draw the line. And so I think that the takeaway, one of the takeaways for me from this project was really this question of the fact that Kws Tshuaj is not a definable title, but it's more of an idealized category, So which is why, like, I also wouldn't say that these 18 people I interviewed are Kws Tshuaj. I think what I've just been trying to do is understand, what does that term mean to people? What did that someone who would be called a Kws Tshuaj, what did they do in the past? And how have the descendants of people like that kind of positioned themselves in the modern world, given all of the changes, like we're talking about, conversion to Christianity, interaction with the Western medicine worlds. There's so many changes that are embracing the community, and we know that the Chua is continuing, but the tradition's changing. So yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if I didn't explain that very well. Of the people I worked with, half of them were like these kind of spiritual people, and half of them weren't. So the sample that I selected here is actually pretty representative, I think, but I focused more on the Dachua stuff because I didn't find almost any references to that in the literature, and I wanted to kind of draw attention to something that I felt like was being a little bit overlooked. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Sita?
Well, thank you. So I just have a general question. So it looks like you went through many different communities, like Hmong communities, to collect medicinal plants or to conduct studies on them. Have you noticed any trends or patterns on if they, like, for example, they might collect more plants related to cold medicine for cold symptoms, and if that does happen, do they all appear to collect the same type of plants, like at different regions, things like that, and when they do collect them, does it evolve according to the people that live there, like or not? Like, for example, do they adapt to using plants from that area as well, or not? Like, do their plants also grow in numbers?
Okay, thanks, Sita. It's a pleasure to talk with you also for the first time. Sita is the real expert on Chua Hmong here, he's worked on this subject for many years. So yes, in other words, yes, I think this was one of the most fascinating things that I learned in this PhD research, is that there does appear to be maybe it's around 200 to 250 species of Chua Hmong that are almost universal. In other words, I found those 250 species in every single Hmong community I visited on 4 different continents. I found an extraordinary level of consistency between what plants are being used by Hmong people today in Thailand and what plants Hmong people are using today in Madison, what plants people are using in Neeb, what plants people are using in French Guiana. And that really blew my mind, and it made me realize there is a real Hmong pharmacopoeia that's very typically Hmong. And anyway, I would love one day to collaborate with someone like you and write collect all of these plants together in a single book that covers all of the major medicine plants. And to your second question, yes, there is definitely adoption of new plants. I found Hmong people in French Guiana are using local Amazonian medicine plants that they learned from Amerindians. Hmong people in France are learning to, use European medicine plants and picking up plants there. Hmong folks in Madison are, picking up plants there. They're digging up Solomon's seal and planting it in their gardens. There's so much exchange of knowledge, and it's a very dynamic knowledge. And maybe the universalness of Hmong medicine that I found today is only due to the fact that it was the first generation of folks that brought those plants from Laos. Maybe in 20 years, we won't see a universal Hmong pharmacopoeia anymore.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'll just say one thing, which struck me is that actually a lot of the things that you described could almost be described exactly the same for Lao traditional medicine people. I myself initiated with a Lao traditional medicine person in which we had to give an offering to a spirit. I had to pay some money. We had to, do a ritual before I was even allowed to hear anything about the traditions. Unfortunately, I ended up not, pursuing that as much as I could have, but I did learn what the process was, that not anyone could just go and ask somebody, that you actually had to often be initiated first before you were allowed to actually get knowledge. And I'm just wondering if that came up in any of your discussions with people. Did people say, well, listen, I can't really tell you this because you're not initiated yet, and you would need to be initiated in order for me to be able to pass this knowledge on to you. Otherwise, the spirits would get angry. Is that something that you heard at all?
Wow, that's so interesting. I didn't realize that, first of all, about the similarities with Lao traditional medicine. I don't know much about Lao. I've never worked there as an anthropologist. Anyway, in a way, yes, there were people who said, I can't talk to you about this particular subject, but overall, I found that people were really surprisingly open. It was a little bit like I mentioned. I think especially folks in the diaspora, a lot of the people I met, there was this sense of loss of the tradition that's kind of beginning. They were really sad, some of these women, that their own granddaughters and daughters are not seeking out this knowledge anymore, and they're kind of wondering what's going to happen to it. So I think that maybe if I'd done this work even like 20, 30, 40 years ago, probably people would not have wanted to speak with me, but I think that today, like considering the way things are happening, people were way more open. But to be clear, Ian, most of the time it wasn't me physically who was speaking with the person. Usually there was a Hmong project partner or somebody else there who was helping have that conversation. I was there. They knew that I was, the project was, whatever, a project that I had initiated. But there's also that element, right? A lot of times it might be a Hmong student who's speaking with a Hmong elder. So there's going to be a transmission of knowledge there that I would never be privy to anyway, So obviously there's a great deal of ethical concerns about how you work with this knowledge as well, To be clear, that's why I'm focusing on the circulation rather than trying to write down everyone's secret recipes of their medicine plants. That's a very sensitive issues, really.
So I see Zua's hand up again. Zua, do you want to say something?
Oh, you can go to Tang because I've already asked a question. So there's time after Tang.
Okay, Tang, you can go first.
Hi, Alex. Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I was just wondering, did you find that younger folks, younger kids, teenagers, millennials were getting more interested in Hmong plants and herbs and their uses during your research?
Well, I mean, I know you're interested, so there, there's some folks out there. I mean, to be completely honest, I never met anybody that was that young. I never met any Hmong folks that didn't have children yet, that were truly interested in this. Once I found that once women were starting to have children in their 30s and so on, like, I mean, I'm just speaking like maybe not in your 20s, but a little bit older than that, I found that there was usually some appreciation and interest in that knowledge. And there was a lot of people who said, gosh, why didn't I ask my grandmother about those plants? I can picture the plants, but I don't know their names. I don't know where she grew them. There was sometimes this kind of like sense of having missed the ball. But I will say I did meet 3 or 4 very inspiring, I would call them younger women in their 40s, early 40s, who are really working hard to preserve this knowledge, pass it on, collect it, and transmit it. So, I mean, yes and no, basically, Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Zua, you want to follow up? Maybe this might be getting close to the last question, but we'll see.
Okay, thank you. I was really curious, the case study that you presented about the conflict between Christianity and the traditional Kws Tshuaj. And I was wondering, you talked a little bit also about the herbal medicine as being complementary, but I'm wondering if you also picked up any data that suggested that there is actually conflict between the usage of traditional Hmong herbal medicine and Western medicine in terms of the kinds of potential side effects that might occur, and if that may play a role at all in the reluctance of some of your participants to self-identify as Kws Tshuaj, especially I'm thinking in the context of the US, for instance, where they could potentially get into problems with the legal authorities or whatnot, right? Because there's a lot of, you mentioned the sharing of knowledge through Facebook and YouTube now. Well, Hmong radio is a huge avenue and platform for circulating information about traditional medicines as well too. And so, and oftentimes, it's like the snake man oil that they hear from Laos and then they order in grows, right? And it can be really scary what people are willing to put into their bodies because of, just hearing from one person pass to another, but also the potential of being caught in the legal system for doing this, especially for treatments like cancer, right? I know a lot of older Hmong cancer patients who use herbal medicine would prefer that over going to their doctor and getting chemo or things like that. And so that's where some of the intergenerational conflict might come in, where younger generations might want the older generation to actually adhere to the Western medicine modalities as opposed to, so they see it as mutually exclusive as opposed to complementary. And I wonder if you picked up on any of that.
Thank you. That is such an interesting question. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I think right away I can see that you understand these issues better than I do. I would say that so on the one hand, I mean, I found that there was being Christian did not seem to be a deterrent to using Tshuaj. I felt like the only conflicts that I heard about were between, Christianity and the theology of Christianity and the spiritual element of it. I almost wonder if the increasing presence of Christianity in the Hmong community is not one of the factors that's pushing the disappearance of the spiritual side, kind of almost like secularizing the Kws Tshuaj tradition. What I mean to say is that some people told me that, in Laos, there were people who had Da Tshuaj spirits, and there were people who didn't have Da Tshuaj spirits, but those people would still make a Da Tshuaj altar, because they would know that only with the Da Tshuaj altar could they receive monetary offerings. So if you see what I mean, people kind of gave me the sense that in the context of Southeast Asia and the kind of animistic, worldview that was shared by the Lao and all the other peoples in that part of the world, there was maybe pressure to emphasize this animistic element of the work with medicine plants. And now maybe today with the Christian influence, there's kind of an opposite push to kind of secularize the engagement with the medicine plants, to think about them as kind of comparable to biomedicine, and to kind of, there is that effect that the biomedical philosophy has on traditional medicine. There's always this sense that, okay, now we have to really like codify and justify this medicinal herb tradition to kind of make it comparable to Western medicine. So interestingly, I mean, I think you'd find this fascinating. I met a couple people who are both, the daughter or granddaughter of a Kuchua, and they're greatly knowledgeable about medicinal herbs, but they also are a practicing nurse. I met multiple people like that in the US as well as in Thailand, people who had been trained as a biomedical nurse, but also were basically considered an herbal medicine expert. So I think there is a certain degree of exchange and complementarity there, but I totally hear you that, especially when it comes to the dried medicines, I mean, there is legitimately some real danger there of, a lot of Chinese medicines have been found to have all kinds of strange, pollutants in them and stuff. And you just wonder, what on earth are people taking, I think that's why the tuanjua is a lot safer. I mean, it is safe, basically. These are gentle plants. None of these plants that I looked into were like poisonous or, like significantly dangerous. But although Sita, would probably be the one to answer that question. But in general, working with fresh plants from your own garden is the direction that the tradition has moved in the diaspora. Whereas in Laos, people are doing a lot more gathering wild, very strong medicines from the jungle. And those could have real complications, I think, sometimes with Western, medicines. So the fact that people are, all the older women that I met are taking Western medicines and also taking Chomong. So there's an important question there, I think, that you're opening up about the interactions and between those. Yeah.
So earlier I saw Sandra's hand up, but then it went down. Sandra, do you have anything you would like to say before we finish up?
Oh, sorry, I trying to adjust my phone. I just really want to thank you, Alex, for such a wonderful presentation. I was about to post it in there, but I just want to give kudos to you. I know how important it is to have this type of knowledge, in some kind of historical context that's written down, and it's really important for our younger generations, for our old generations. And I think what you presented today is I can attest to a lot of it. I am not a Quechua myself. I would never claim that name, but I know quite a few of my grandmothers, and you are correct. Often, that knowledge is really kept secret. But I think living here in the US, different from what you have experienced elsewhere in other countries, I think this mental or this mindset here in the US has really opened up a lot of our Quechuas to be open to scholars such as yourself and our Hmong students ourselves, to capture that into some kind of written record for future generations to use. And, I can attest to what you said as well. In my own garden, I have probably quite a collection of those 200 to 250 universal medicinal plants that you have found in your research. So overall, I just want to compliment you and thank you so much for your work. And thank you so much for your presentation. And I look forward to future expansions of this topic.
Thank you so much,
Sandra. So I think we should probably be ending up soon, but this was a wonderful presentation, and some of you may know others who would like to see this, and I'm sorry that there's not more people here tonight, but unfortunately this will be recorded and put on the Hmong Studies Consortium website very soon, so it'll be available for people to watch moving forward. And I know this is but one of Alex's dissertation chapters. And, maybe in about a year or so, or when he's getting near the end of his dissertation, we might, invite him back to tell us something else, because I know there's a lot of stories that he could tell us apart from what he's told us tonight. So thank you so much, Alex, for coming. Thank you for everyone else for coming. And if you are not on our listserv but would like to be for future talks and events, please send me an email and I will put you on the list. So thank you again, and let's give one last virtual applause for Alex.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
It's
you.
been great. I'd love to do it again.